Hey there, this is Kate from Tested. Today I'm going to be talking to you about plaster bandages. Now you may be thinking, what the heck can I do with plaster bandages? These can be used for so many things. What I'm going to do today is build up an artificial landscape and use the plaster bandages to make my hard surface. This surface can later be painted, add some greenery to it, maybe some little mini rocks, whatever you need to do to make a fun, quick landscape. What's cool about these plaster bandages is that you can find them either online through Amazon, from an art store, or a medical supply store. So they have a myriad of uses. You may have seen them used before for life casting, body casting, like maybe taking a mold of someone's face. There's just so many things that you can do with it, and I really like that it is something quick, cheap, simple, and relatively non-toxic. So let's jump in. I'm going to start by constructing a base. So I have a piece of plywood here. You can use anything you want. It really doesn't have to be too thick or sturdy, especially because the end product isn't going to weigh that much. Obviously, do whatever you need to for your particular project. I'm going to sculpt the form of my hillscape here out of just regular aluminum foil. Again, something I really like about using aluminum foil is that you can easily get your shape figured out, laid down, and you didn't have to spend that much time carving foam or building anything up out of clay. It's pretty quick and easy. The other cool thing about this is you might have a hill that you think that's just too high. So what do? Just go in and push it down some more. All right, now what this aluminum foil is going to represent are any of the forms that I need. It's all going to be covered with the plaster bandages, so it doesn't need to be pretty. It's okay if there's gaps here and there, or if you don't cover the whole surface, because the real finished surface is going to be all with the plaster bandages. This is just going to give us our height, our undulation, any sort of form underneath. All right, now that I have a general form, this is basically just going to be a little bit of a hilly scape, maybe a slight valley in the middle. I am going to take masking tape and just sort of make sure that it's all stuck down to the base, maybe stuck together, so that it's not so free floating like that. Give it just a little bit of hold. All right, this should be pretty good. All we're looking for is that the foil's not going to move. It's secured both to the base and sort of to each other in relationship. So I think that that'll provide just enough hold. Now that we have our base form sculpted out and ready to go, I have covered the table with paper. Maybe you want to put down some plastic, anything like that to keep general, plaster goo off your work surface. I have gloves on because it's going to get messy. First step is to take your plaster bandages and start cutting out strips ahead of time. So we are going to guesstimate about how big of strips we want. Probably about like that. I'm going to cut my first strip, and then I usually will just use this first one as a template. The great thing about these strips is that even if you want some to be shorter, you can always fold them over as you work with them. So it's not all that important exactly how long they are. Now that we have all of the strips cut, I'm going to get my water ready. Now, as you see, I already have some water in this container. This is just whatever came out of the sink. But when working with plaster, I like to use warm water. So I also have this kettle, which has hot water in it. So I'm going to mix it with the cool water because I don't need boiling water for this. All right, I like to use a wide, shallow dish like this because we're going to be essentially just dipping, and I like to drag along the edge. So you want something that's big enough that gives you that space. I'm going to set my small piece off to the side. I'm gonna take my first bit here. I'm gonna test the water, make sure, yeah, it's warm. Now, this is about to get messy, so, you know, put your phone away, do whatever you need to, and be ready to be covered in gunk for quite a while. All right, I'm going to dip, and what I do is drag. This helps get some of the excess water off, like so. I'm gonna be careful of letting it fold in on itself. It's not that big of a deal, but it might add some added height and dimension if you're not looking for that. All right. And as you see, as you start to lay it over, it's pliable, it's really thin, and as you brush your finger over the top of it, it smooths that plaster out. So you actually aren't seeing as much of the mesh pattern. I tend to do a few layers of this, so you don't have to necessarily worry about your base layer being perfect. You might add another layer on top of that, so you might not even see your base layer. Now, one of the things about working with plaster bandages is that if you don't add enough stuff on top of them later, you might see the telltale mesh pattern underneath. So I work really hard, even on my base layer, to smooth out some of that so that it's not as obvious how you've made this surface. You can also take this time to do a bit of secondary sculpting. As you lay the mesh over it, you're going to see where you might have, you know, an unnatural point sticking up in the foil, and you can just push that down. Now, if you start to get some areas like this where it's hanging off the edge a bit longer than you want, feel free to just take your scissors and trim it right off. So here we have a really good first base layer of these. What I'm going to do, obviously I'm not going to have enough from these strips to do a second pass. I'm going to open up another roll and cut some strips from that. And what I'm going to do in this area to add extra strength is to go the opposite direction. So now I'm going to go in the opposite direction and just add a little more strength. I know we have a lot of viewers that like to do projects with their children, and I feel like this is a really good material to do with kids. It's relatively non-toxic, it's pretty easy, it's hard to mess it up, and it's fun. You get to do a lot of finger sculpting. All right, so this is 2 layers of my plaster bandages. I could theoretically go in for a 3rd layer if I wanted to. My particular use case, I am going to be covering this in a thick acrylic base and then putting some greenery on top. So a lot of my sins can be hidden that way. I think I'm in a pretty good spot otherwise, so I might finish, but you might notice there are a little bit of seams in between the bandages that you can see, or you might see a little bit of the mesh still visible here. So it's up to you how long you want to spend, how much detail you want to do. I'm pretty okay with it at this point, so I'm going to let this dry and come back and start painting it. Well, now that the plaster bandages have dried, you can see they are firm and ready to go. I am just going to do a quick base coat painting. There is some stuff called green undercoat, since I'm going to do a little bit of green foliage on top of here. Figure I'll just start with that and get a base going. I'm gonna use a foam brush. Let's see how this goes. Bloop, bloop, bloop. I do kind of like the texture it gives just by being uneven. It's cool, the different shades of green you get. All right, I've finished my undercoat. As you can see, it's somewhat thin, but I actually really like the way that it's uneven in places because it looks more like a natural terrain. You can still see a bit of the mesh texture from these plaster bandages. I'm just gonna finish it out by putting on a little bit of turf, you know, some flocking basically in a few spots. But if you really wanted to cover more of the texture, you could use an acrylic paint that's thicker, or you could have applied a little bit more plaster, whatever you need. This, I think, is looking pretty good for being a quick project. All right, I have finished applying my flocking, and I don't know, I think as far as being a super simple two-step finishing job, it looks pretty good. The undercoat paint that I did, I really like that it has dark and light spots, so it adds that depth in there already without me having to do multiple passes. And then I just sprinkled some flocking right on top. And you can see how nice and firm and rigid this is. The plaster has set up quite firm. This is pretty good, especially if you're into tabletop games and you like to make some landscapes for your figures. If you've got a little diorama that you want to set stuff up with. Just, this stuff is very versatile, and this is what I whipped together quickly today. I'd like to see how you use plaster bandages, so let me know what you come up with. Thanks.